Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew, and we're in Matthew chapter 14, and I'm going to be reading verses 22 through 36. This is the episode of Peter walking on the water towards Jesus. John tells us about this episode as well. And we really have more detail, more key detail about the event in Matthew's gospel. But in John's gospel, we understand why these events take place. Let's go ahead and read the verses and then we'll talk about them. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And after he sent the multitudes away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already many stadia away from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking upon the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were frightened and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, and do not be afraid." And he said, And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are certainly God's Son." And when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent into all the surrounding district and brought to him all who were ill. And they began to entreat him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak. And as many as touched it were cured. Okay. John lets us know why he sent the apostles to the other side and before he dismissed the crowd. John tells us that the crowd was trying to seize Jesus and make him a king. And of course, the apostles never, until the day of Pentecost, it seems, get what the whole thing was about, even though Jesus tells them plainly. And so that's a very dangerous situation. And so Jesus does this. He gets rid of his apostles, gets them out of there by sending them in a boat to the other side, then dismisses the crowd, and then goes by himself up into the mountain to pray. And he's there from the setting of the sun to about 3 in the morning. The fourth watch of the night takes place between about 3 and 6 in the morning. It's the last watch before the sunrise. And so this is the time in which this happens. So at this time, the apostles should have been able, with any luck at all, to be most of the way to the other side, if not to the other side. And yet they weren't, because the wind was against them. And it was a very strong wind. No amount of tacking was going to get them across to the other side. And in the middle of this, they see Jesus walking to them on the water, and they think it's a ghost. They say it's a ghost. What do they believe about ghosts? I don't really know. But this is not the last time we hear, disciples think that they're seeing or hearing a ghost, because in Acts chapter 12, when Peter is sprung from prison by the angel on the eve of his execution there in Jerusalem, and he goes to Mary's house and he knocks on the door. Rhoda doesn't open to him, and they all think it's his ghost. So they must have felt like the disembodied spirit of somebody can wander the earth for a while after death. I don't know, but that's what it seems they're thinking. And he says in the translation, "It's me." And it can be translated that way. But what he says is, I am. I am. And it recalls, as John does many times in his gospel, as he reports, I should say, many times in his gospel, Jesus saying the I am, and reminding us of the moment at the burning bush where God, Yahweh, identifies himself as the I am. I am. And Peter says, if it's you, tell me to walk on the water. Now, what would make that pop into his head? Would it pop into yours? It's the last thing on earth that would pop into my head, but it did. And Jesus says, come. And he gets out of the boat. We think of Jesus as the man who walked on water, but Peter knows what it's like to walk on water because he did it too. And who knows how far he got before he took his eyes off Jesus. And it says he started to sink. That's not what happens to a human being dropped in the water. You go down, maybe bob up and go down again as you struggle to stay afloat. But you don't start to sink. You don't just start to go under slowly. But that's what's described. As he starts to be afraid, he slowly starts to sink into the water like it's quicksand. And then he does the right thing. He did the wrong thing to take his eyes off Jesus and to look at the winds and the waves. But then he does the right thing. He cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus did. His hand is right there. I don't know what distance there was between Jesus and Peter when he started to sink, but it doesn't matter because when he cried out, Lord, save me, the hand of Jesus was there. And they together walked back to the boat and climbed into the boat. It's an amazing thing to visualize in your head, isn't it? And the minute Jesus stepped onto the boat, the wind stopped. And they worshiped. And they said, you're the Son of God. And this is another one of those lived parables. It teaches us so much. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Look away from everything else and just focus on Jesus, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And that's exactly what Peter was doing when he was successfully walking on water. With our eyes fixed on Jesus, we can do anything he bids us to do. But when we take our eyes off Jesus, we start to sink. But when that happens, we know what to do, don't we? We need to cry out, Lord, save me. And his hand will always be there. Just a comment about those last few verses. Jesus' celebrity is really about him being a miracle worker. And that's going to be unfortunate because people are going to not listen so much to what he has to say. Matthew makes it clear that his teachings become more difficult at that point, kind of to winnow out those who really want to hear and those who are just there for the floor show. But it says that people would touch the tassel, the fringe of his cloak, and as many as touched it would be healed. That will parallel some things that are said about Peter and about Paul later on in the book of Acts. This tassel of his garment, we've already talked about that when he healed the woman with the hemorrhage. He would have worn a prayer shawl, something he could have put up over his head, but that he would have worn around like this, almost like a sash, and it would have had 4 tassels on it, and that would have hung down, and those tassels would have recalled prayers, and you could touch them and say the prayers that you would recite. And faithful Pharisees said 18 benedictions a day, and so you'd have these, and so that's what they were touching. And they had such faith that if they would just touch that, they'd be healed, and that's what happened. Okay. Scribes and Pharisees are going to have a complaint next time. We're going to pick up with chapter 15. Thank you for joining me for what is now nearly 10 good minutes with the Word.